I think the
Mhm.
mission is to build a culture, a set of technologies, and to build a world around Bitcoin.
All right, welcome back to Bitcoin is Hard. This is a Choice App production about Bitcoin and personal finance. Today we're joined with Yago, who's a core contributor to Sovryn. And today we're talking about decentralized finance and its connection to Bitcoin and its connection to personal finance. So, Yago, hit you with this random fact for the audience right off the top. You're a PhD dropout for neuroscience, and then you went on to get your MBA. We don't always take it back to education, but hit us with that. What was that path?
Basically, I made the mistake of getting massively overeducated. And then when I realized I was getting overeducated, I quit. Um, I um, I studied philosophy in my first degree, philosophy and history. Um, the first degree drew me to conclude that I can't be a good philosopher unless I understand human perception. That thought got me to start working on a PhD in neuroscience. And through that PhD program, I started working on neural networks, which is the
Mhm.
structure of the brain. So started building systems around that. Everything that I was doing outside of academia was much more interesting, faster, and more experimental than what was happening in academia. So I quit. And the MBA I was extremely embarrassed to do, but the way I used to explain it to myself back then was you pay $150,000 and you get a visa to the United States. At the time, I believed that the United States was the land of opportunity. I still believe to a great extent it is, but I one of the weirdest experiences I had was the degree to which uh, I encountered Americans not understanding what made America great. I used to describe it as the "I just work here" attitude, right? So, Americans, I'm just American. I just live here,
Mhm.
um, and um, so that was one very important thing that I learned living in the US. And then the
Mhm.
other really big, in many ways, bigger thing that happened to me in the US was while I was working on a startup. So the startup was in the medical sciences space. We were doing diagnostics, but what I was bringing was effectively using machine learning to build diagnostic tools. And I was reading papers in network science, and that's how I came across the Satoshi white paper in 2011.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
that screwed up my life royally because every plan that I had up until that moment changed. And I've been all Bitcoin all the time ever since.
That's amazing. So that what's also awesome about this is that it puts a lot of things in context of I appreciate your Twitter. Like I really like your Twitter. And the reason why I want to have this episode is because I'm frustrated with the just like Bitcoin being left out of just the DeFi and the Web3 like conversation, you know? And so it feels like you're someone who thinks a lot about the culture of that and the culture of Bitcoin and the culture of crypto. And so I just want to spend as much time like on that as possible and definitely like educate the listeners on like what it is that Sovryn does and like the need for decentralized exchanges and definitely like hitting the nuts and bolts like of that. Definitely want to do that and I can talk about my experience of using Sovryn also. Um, but start us at that higher level, like kind of continue the story. Like I love the way that dovetailed into okay, you found the white paper. Talk about early days of thinking about Bitcoin, and yeah, fast forward us there with what we need to learn and how we can help this conversation get over the kind of like rut that it's stuck in.
Well, so Bitcoin was a revelation for me for a few reasons. One was I had a, a personal experience with the absolute importance of being able to maintain financial independence in order to maintain any other form of independence. It is the bedrock of freedom. My family in South Africa went through hyperinflation. I was there. I grew up in a family of people who had been pursued by the apartheid government for opposing it. Uh, um, my grandparents on the other side were Holocaust survivors, And every single time the story was the same. You lose your financial freedoms before you lose anything else. They start monitoring your financial activity before they start monitoring anything else. So that was one aspect. The other aspect is I and I think this is part of why I went to philosophy as my first degree. I have, a deep and abiding belief in a weird sort of uh, weird today, right? It's very unfashionable today to be optimistic, but I'm
Mm-hmm.
deeply optimistic about what is possible for the human experience and what human agency is able to do in the universe. For a long time, my tagline on Facebook was "imposition of will upon reality," and I saw in Bitcoin this extremely agency, like individual agency oriented technology, which focused on empowering the individual and creating this asymmetric power where individuals could impose their will upon their reality, despite massive organizations like governments, because of the asymmetry of power in Bitcoin. And then the third aspect of it was I believed, I used to volunteer teaching economics in schools because I think economics is, the understanding of human incentives. And if you understand human incentives, and this kind of goes back to the psychology, my interest in psychology, you understand human incentives, you can predict to a greater degree human behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and one of the things that I thought was wrong with the world was that the internet was this amazing 21st century technology married to an incentive structure from the age of the pharaohs, right? You have a few pharaohs, they own all of the servers. And the reason this exists is because there are no property rights inherent to the internet. Uh, Bitcoin, as this, digital commodity, invented the idea of cryptographic and, more importantly, digital borderless property rights. So, like, the white paper hit me like a ton of bricks because it, there were these threads which I'd been thinking about for years, and they suddenly came together in this one extremely elegant um, concept. So I knew that this was going to have implications for everything that I would do for the rest of my life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that has, I suppose, maybe disappointed me a little bit with Bitcoin is that in the Bitcoin community, I think we frequently celebrate the people who are buying and selling Bitcoin, or the people who are, talking about the Bitcoin price in USD, rather than the people who are building in Bitcoin. And you just think about like the number of names, like, of Bitcoiners, right? So you could probably, if you think about the top 3 or 4 names that come to mind, you got influencers, you got people like, Michael Saylor, who are buying, and you got people like, uh, you know, um, Plan B, who are saying it's going to X amount, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that when we think about hyper Bitcoinization, we need to think about more than just Bitcoin being, the most important asset, because it's never going to be the most important asset. If you live in a society where money is the most important asset, that is an extremely impoverished society. But if you have stable money, sound money, then you can have a flourishing of all of the other assets, and a flourishing of culture, and a
Mm-hmm.
flourishing of human potential, right? And so I think, for me, building on Bitcoin, hyper Bitcoinization is taking the core philosophical ideas of Bitcoin and imposing their will upon reality in a broader sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
No,
so,
super
yeah.
well. Yeah. So go ahead.
No, so I think that's the mission. I think the
Mm-hmm.
mission is to build a culture, um, to build a set of technologies, and to build a world around Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Why? So for the uninitiated, why is there a rift between people that are quote unquote building DeFi and people that are, you know, just subscribe to like Bitcoin as sound money and investment like thesis?
I think there are a number of reasons. One is, and this is the most important reason, it's very hard to build on Bitcoin
Mm-hmm.
from a technical perspective. So up until quite recently, there weren't any reasonable tools to do it. Lightning Network is providing some tools, but it's never going to provide all of them. Now we have things like the Rootstock sidechain. We've got other efforts like Stacks. There's things like Taro. But it remains extremely difficult. And
Mm-hmm.
people who follow me on Twitter, I'm sort of like banging on the on this idea frequently that we need to invest more in providing tools for people to
Mm-hmm.
build on Bitcoin so that Bitcoin can take its rightful place in the world.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also a cultural aspect. Um, there's a very important idea in Bitcoin, which is that Bitcoin, I sometimes say that Bitcoin is not software, Bitcoin is permaware. And that ideally, what we would want is for Bitcoin never to change, to be like TikTok, block after block, like a law of nature.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think we need to take that idea further than I almost ever hear anyone else speak about it, which is to say, I think we need to get to Bitcoin code complete. We talk about Bitcoin as still being beta sometimes, as almost a badge of honor. I see it as a badge of shame. Bitcoin should be code complete. In other words, we should know that there is no more changes coming to Bitcoin. But in order for that to happen, we need to introduce the few changes that will allow everything that needs to be innovated around the Bitcoin ecosystem to easily integrate trustlessly, cryptographically with Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
But if you don't view things that way, you become extremely conservative because you don't see us on a path to Bitcoin code complete. You just see us on a path to potentially endlessly adding things to Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're becoming very protective because we don't want to add things to Bitcoin, which is exactly the right idea, but drawing the wrong conclusion. The wrong conclusion is not stop developing, it's be extremely focused on what it is that you're developing. Develop only those things which will allow you to get to code complete as quickly as possible.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another aspect of it. And then perhaps the third is the cultural aspect. I don't think Bitcoiners celebrate innovation as much as many other communities. And I think a big part of that is, what I just mentioned. But the other part of that is the traumatic events of the block size wars coupled with the almost flippening of Ethereum, which happened like a 1-2 punch almost at the same time and made the antibodies of Bitcoin culture highly reactionary, and I think have now become an almost autoimmune response where we are instead of having an immune system, we're having an allergic reaction.
Mm-hmm.
And so the culture no longer knows how to celebrate it. And that was not the case, right? Bitcoin used to be a culture of
Right. Right.
excitement, innovation, adventure, courage.
Yes.
Now I find frequently it's a culture of tribalism, defensiveness, and number go up technology.
One of the reasons why I love this conversation and I just 2022 feels fresh to me. It feels fresh and I'm trying to cover new ground. And I think something that has been way undercovered is exactly, I'm glad you brought up the block size wars and I'm glad you brought up the ETH flippening because something that I think Bitcoin Cash proponents liked Bitcoin as money and liked talking about circular economy and liked talking about the real economy and Bitcoin involved in the real economy. This is super overgeneralizing, but they hit a wall. And then there was a discussion about forking code when they should have not, in my opinion, one of the other ways of doing it would have been to not fork code. It would have been to press harder at the culture level, fight harder at the culture level, rather than forking code and watering down into two buckets, which there are legitimate frustrations with Bitcoin that you can have and are expressed in different words, and we nitpick different ways of doing it. And there, I could have everything you've already said today. Even I could nitpick it to death for the next like hour, and we wouldn't do anything. Like that would not get anywhere. That'd be so. What's interesting is just sitting here and acknowledging when Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash forked, there was also a cultural fork. And same thing, if we call ETH was not a fork of Bitcoin, but when people chose to go and work on ETH instead of working on Bitcoin, there was a code fork that also forked culture. And that's where you get the like tinkering in DeFi and Web3 lingo and all of the innovation, that's where this whole then narrative comes from of like Bitcoin is the MySpace, Bitcoin is the boomer, Bitcoin is the rock, and then like this other stuff is like quote unquote where it's at. And I agree with you about the overreaction to the immune response. I agree. And I say this one thing, I don't know if it's super helpful, but I just like repeating it. Like I feel like 2014 Bitcoiners and before, it was like pretty consistent. And then I feel like 15 is like almost like the Gen X of Bitcoin, where you're like caught between these two worlds. You're caught between kind of just seeing some like really raw stuff and caught between kind of like the millennial ICO kids that like screwed it all up, you know? And so we've had this whole thing. And what I think we're happening now is like 2022, everything that you listed off of like Rootstock, Taro, Stacks, like there's some really good discrete log contracts. Like there's some really positive things that are hammering this like intersection of like Bitcoin and decentralized finance. And at the same time, it's like I think there's now enough people that are able to kind of like, for lack of a better term, like leave the baggage of the past behind and like analyze what is happening in Bitcoin and crypto right now. Like, where are we right now? Like, really taking like stock of where we've been, but almost starting right now with a like kind of a blank slate. Like, that's what I've been trying to do this year mentally, and not forget any of the lessons that I've learned, and not forget anything that I like, that I come in with, but just trying to super reanalyze. And so, any more thoughts on like culture, or can you hit like a few like or say any closing thoughts on culture? We'll come back to it, but then I'm ready to dive in on like nailing down a few parts of language around DeFi.
Well, in terms of culture, the project that I'm working on, Sovryn, has placed culture as one of its core tenets, building this culture of innovation for Bitcoin, but also building this culture of Bitcoin for everything else.
Mm-hmm.
And the way we express it is changing what it means to be a nation. Today the nation is sort of like a bunch of people who are fenced in, like in a zoo. This is the nation state. It has geographical monopoly in terms of laws. You're born into it. You're American. You're Russian. You're whatever. And it's an extremely foreign concept to our actual everyday lives. Our everyday lives, we're interacting. I mean, yeah, I don't know where you are right now. I don't know half the time where I am right now.
Yep.
But
Yep.
we are culturally aligned far more than the people who are geographically proximate to us.
Totally.
And so our world is increasingly a world of ideas because they're borderless, and because the internet is borderless. And so we think that the very idea of what nationhood stands for is changing. It is a question of shared ideas, shared culture, and shared purpose. And I think Bitcoiners have that. And so we want to make that explicit. And so we frequently talk about a nation of sovereigns, a nation of sovereign individuals, as being what the Bitcoin, or at least the first Bitcoin nation, can and should be if we're intentional about building it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, perfect. So yeah, tell us about Sovryn. So how is it doing that? How is Sovryn doing that? And explain to the listeners like what Sovryn is.
Okay, so Sovryn is a set of protocols which have a shared governance, and it's primarily built on the Bitcoin sidechain Rootstock, but it is also integrated with Lightning Network, and we're working to deepen the integrations with all parts of Bitcoin Layer 2 to make it easy to develop on Bitcoin Layer 2. But it's different from every other project, I think, out there, in that it is tied together, not by being an alternate chain or even an alternate coin. There's no, Bitcoin is the coin, right? but by having this shared uh, coordination system, a governance system, an institutional system. And the first thing that it's focused on is building out the tools which allow people to extend the um, the sovereignty, the financial sovereignty that Bitcoin gives them. Today, the primary thing that you can do with Bitcoin is hodl, and the secondary thing that you can do with Bitcoin is speculate, trade, right? Um, hodling is very hard. You need to um, deny yourself. You don't spend. You don't think about today. You think about tomorrow, and you wait for the world to catch up with you. Um, One of the a big part of the tools that are built around Sovryn are tools which are designed to either allow your Bitcoin to work for you to earn more Bitcoin, to help you stack sats, or to allow you to unlock the economic activity, the dollar value, if you will, of your Bitcoin right now, so that you can secure your future but live for today. The um, way that Sovryn has approached what you might call DeFi, or what Sovryn is increasingly called SoundFi, right? Sound finance for sound money, is totally different from the way it has been approached by every other DeFi ecosystem. And I think this has been wonderfully highlighted by the Luna Terra debacle, right? So in Sovryn, that could never happen. Uh, Algorithmic stablecoins aren't able to enter into the system because the system is an opt-in self-regulating system, and what regulates it is this governance process, right? Is what we call the bitocracy. And the
Mm-hmm.
bitocracy is designed around, rather than having a voting system and trying to align a majority, it's designed around aligning economic incentives, just like Bitcoin. So the way bitocracy works is uh, proof of staked time, or proof of commitment, POC, right? In other words, you have economic value in this commitment token, the SOV token, and you can stake it for increasing amounts of time. And that forces you to think very, very long term, because there's nothing you can do with it after you've staked. Until it's released, you can't create a derivative around it. You can't touch it. It's not like other systems, or like, for example, Ethereum staking. They have now, you know, uh, a derivative of it. So basically, you haven't done anything. You haven't given up any real
Mm-hmm.
liquidity. So it imposes a very uncomfortable economic cost, and it actually encourages you to accept that economic cost for as long as possible, because then you will earn a greater share of the protocol revenue, but
Mm-hmm.
also have a greater share of votes within the system. Right? It's definitely not a democracy. This is not a democracy. This is,
Mm-hmm.
people who like democracy will not like this. It's designed to advantage those who are more committed,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and to enforce long-term thinking, right? Low time preference. And as a result, certain types of systemic coordination within the system, which is required in order to have a sound financial system, are possible. Not allowing in algorithmic stablecoins so that you don't have systemic risk infect the entire system is something that Sovryn can do, but no other ecosystem. Now, you can extend this idea further, right? And think about Sovryn as like the the regulatory body. Right now it's a financial regulatory body, but there are other ways that governments exist. There are other things that government regulate, and we can introduce similar types of economic incentives around that. We can build institutions in order to create borderless, opt-in, voluntary participatory governance, and then people can join this and become members, effectively citizens, or nation members in this nation of sovereigns. And what makes them sovereigns is they opt in and they can opt out at any time. They never give up their keys, and they never give up custody or control of their private information or their economic value. And then tied with that, in order to make this work, There's also a significant effort, both in terms of how we structure the community, right? The community has, we're constantly working on making it easier and more porous for people to actively engage and participate and contribute. Everything is open source, everything has been decentralized from day one. And then the second thing is a big focus on the soft stuff, culture, philosophy, values, making them explicit. Eventually, once we have enough experience as a proto community, we'll create a proto constitution for ourselves, which will make explicit the key things that we believe in.
Hmm.
And so this is it's totally different idea from sound money. It's far more
Hmm.
complicated, it's far more messy. And
Hmm.
you know, that's the beauty of Bitcoin. It doesn't need to be messy. It's able to do just
Yeah.
one thing because it's creating this measurement, this pa-pa, pa-pa,
Yep.
pa-pa, this clock. But now if we want to live our lives to that clock, we need to engage in and roll our sleeves up to the messier realities of what actual human life is. And I think Sovryn is the closest thing to a real alternative, thinking about what a world post the nation state could look like and how it could manage itself.
Yep. Yeah. Two things I want to do now. I want to dive in on like what is rootstock and how do you define side chains and layer twos, just to help people know those phrases. And then I want to jump ahead to like how do you map the like um, sovereign state online to like meat space where people live
Yeah,
in the decentralized finance. So yeah, hit us with that. How do you define sidechain and layer two? I'm guilty of kind of using them interchangeably. I kind of do this on purpose, but if you can delineate between them, I would love to hear it. And then tell us the history of rootstock like briefly.
sure. So I would say that for something to be a Bitcoin layer 2, it needs to meet two criteria. One, it needs to have Bitcoin as the primary money, right? So it can't be, Ethereum wrapped Bitcoin would not count because
Yep.
ETH is the primary money, not WBTC. And the second thing it needs to do is it needs to base its security, right? Its cryptographic security on Bitcoin. I think anything which meets those two criteria is a Bitcoin layer 2. Rootstock as a sidechain, which is a one version of what Bitcoin layer 2 are, like a Lightning network is another version of what Bitcoin layer 2 could be. DLC is another
Mhm.
version of Bitcoin L2. So the way Rootstock accomplishes those two goals is one, so it's a sidechain means it's a separate blockchain, but it is uh, economically and cryptographically tied to Bitcoin. The native asset is Bitcoin. So you peg Bitcoin on main chain and then it moves or it is represented on the Bitcoin side, on the Rootstock sidechain. And then the
Yep.
second thing is it's merged mined with Bitcoin. So Bitcoin miners are mining the consensus of Rootstock. And so it meets those two criteria. I think there's many ways that we can do it. And I'm
Mhm.
hoping that we can do it in better, even tighter and cleaner ways over time. But those are the two criteria that I'm interested in.
So when I use the peg-in feature inside Sovereign and I send Bitcoin and I receive RBTC to my wallet, like what is happening?
What's happening is your Bitcoin is being sent to what is effectively a multi-sig wallet. And
Mhm.
now that it doesn't have to be a multi-sig wallet, it could also be, there are other ways of doing it, but right now it's a multi-sig wallet.
Mhm.
And the multi-sig wallet has multiple different signatories, or because they're signatories to the pegnatories, right? These are the signatories to the peg. And these signatories have a dual role. One, they run a node on both chains, and valid transactions moving in and out of the peg are signed by them. But in addition to that, they run an HSM, a hardware secured module, something which they do not have access to. It's basically a black box.
Mhm.
And they pass SPV proofs of what's happening on the two chains to the black box. So what actually happens is the black box, if it sees a valid transaction, will sign that transaction and pass that transaction on to the pegnatory, and then the pegnatory countersigns that. If the HSMs have signed the transaction and the pegnatory have signed the transaction, and a majority of both has been reached, then Bitcoin can move out can basically be sent out of the peg. So when you're
Yep.
moving your Bitcoin in, you're moving it into this environment where it gets frozen, and issued to you is the RBTC on the blockchain, on the Rootstock
Yep.
blockchain.
Yep.
And when you move out, your RBTC gets destroyed and your Bitcoin is moved back to you. And the trust assurance here is that in order for this system to be compromised, the majority of pegnatories would need to be compromised, as well as the majority of HSMs. Uh,
Mm.
Doing one or the other will not be enough. And so it's a very, very secure, but not perfect system. The primary imperfection of it is that it is not permissionless, not to join, and not to be able to observe whether or not it has been compromised either. So it's been running for many years now, since 2018. And I believe is probably the most secure multi-sig in existence, but it is not good enough for us yet.
Mm.
Where we would like to go is to get to the ultimately to the point where you have cryptographic permissionless assurances, where you can create pegs, and I think this is what allows us to get to Bitcoin code complete. If we have
Mm.
cryptographically secure pegs, um, then anyone is able to not only create a peg, but also observe whether or not that peg has been compromised. And then we can freely move our Bitcoin in and out of various environments with different rule sets, allowing us to expand and do anything we want on Bitcoin.
Totally. And I liked what you said about, so when you're moving, when you peg Bitcoin into Ethereum, and for WBTC, there's their own process for doing that and their own process for locking it on the Bitcoin chain. But then, and we don't even have to super dive in on that because I understand there's differences. The part I want to dive in on is then when you're moving WBTC along the Ethereum blockchain, the transaction fees are paid in ETH. Like, you're required to hold ETH to move the WBTC along the chain. So that's friction to having BTC, as I would use the term, base money, like on, while participating in ETH ecosystem DeFi, which is why there's like, just inserting my own opinion, that's why there's friction in me wanting to be involved in like those apps, because I
Right.
don't want the slippage of holding that other currency. If my understanding is correct, and you can correct me so I can try to repeat it back to you so that I can know it, when you're moving RBTC along the Rootstock blockchain, your transaction fees are in RBTC. Like, so
That's right.
that's why there's synergy. Yeah.
So there's three differences, right? One is what you just mentioned, that you don't have to pay fees in a separate coin.
Mm-hmm.
Second, WBTC is controlled by BitGo, so it's centralized. Third, when you are transacting on Ethereum, because you're paying in ETH, you're both relying on the security of Ethereum and you are contributing to the security of Ethereum. Whereas when you're using Rootstock, you are relying on the merge mine with Bitcoin miners for your security,
Mm-hmm.
and every single transaction adds to the security budget of Bitcoin. So you're not only using the security of Bitcoin, you're also enhancing the security of Bitcoin.
Yep. Yep. So love that. Great description of like Rootstock. And we talked about Sovryn as an app. So I participate in like the lending pool. So I have RBTC sitting in the lending pool, and it's like currently quoted at the 0.31% APY. Like, I can see, like, I've deposited a little over 2 million sats. I can't remember exactly the day I put it in, but I've been paid out like 519 sats. So it's good. Like, and this is super interesting in times when CeFi, like Bitcoin yield like platforms, are like facing issues, like, and not allowing like new money in. So it's a really interesting time for this concept of Bitcoin DeFi. Is there a world where like, and I think what you said about people using the internet to like be more sovereign, like beautiful, like, and agree, how is end game like me taking out a mortgage from Sovryn? Like, is that end game me putting up RBTC, taking out a mortgage from Sovryn? Like, or what's a like, I don't want to use the word real world, because when you use the word real world, that diminishes everything you said about like using the internet to like advance your freedoms, which I agree with. How do you like, what's your perspective on that?
All right. So first of all, I don't think that's the end game. I think that's the middle game.
Okay.
The end game is destruction or complete alternative to the nation state and a true nation of sovereigns,
Hmm.
with a whole new set of an entirely new way of imagining how human interaction works, with societies and governments which are entirely opt-in and potentially pseudonymous. That's, I think,
Hmm.
end game.
Hmm.
Middle game is, at least on the financial side, the provision of the changing finance to be about what finance has always supposed to be about, which is the direction and allocation of capital towards productive and innovative ends,
Hmm.
uh, rather than speculation, rather than regulatory capture. Um, and so yes, providing mortgages, providing loans, creating an alternative to the dollar, creating stable coins, creating pensions where you don't rely on a government, right? So, I mean, think about how many billions of people there are out there who have pensions, right? But and this includes people in the United States, right?
Hmm.
You have a
Hmm.
pension, you have a what is it called in the US? A 401k, right?
Hmm.
You have a 401k, and it's entirely dependent on the type of rules that your bankrupt government introduces about whether or not you're
Hmm.
really actually going to be able to get that money out, right? So, um, if pensions existed on the blockchain, they would be uncensorable. So imagine having uncensorable pensions, and it's also the creation of new avenues of investment, which could be of a more speculative nature, but hopefully, because they're not part of a fiat world, right? They have to achieve a higher hurdle, right? An
Hmm.
ROI hurdle, and so they are going to productive means, and in a system which is built around long-term thinking, are going to be focused on long-term investments rather than short-term investments. So I think that's what middle game looks like. It's changing finance to be more like Bitcoin. So sound money, sound finance. And one question that I think you asked earlier and I didn't answer is how do you make this connection from what I call this world, the universe,
Yep. Yep.
to the metaverse, right? To the
Yep.
blockchain.
Yep.
And I think that the only way you accomplish that is by having um, a degree of effectively a legal autonomy in this world. Now, there are lots of ways of achieving it. It could be on a contractual basis, right? It could be on an escrow basis. Um, but my favorite approach, and this is the thing, that a lot of people, who got to know me in the Bitcoin world, got to know me in the Bitcoin world because I was involved in projects that sought to develop zones of autonomy. Is I think you create um, a layered approach to what governance looks like. And one aspect of this is like, let's talk about mortgages. If the land registry itself
Hmm.
was on the blockchain, right? And that's a fairly low throughput transactional space. So you don't need high frequency land registry changes, right? That
Right.
happens quite slow. So that actually might be an appropriate thing for the canonical record of ownership to be on the blockchain, right? And then you have more localized forms of governance having to refer to that canonical record. And so if you own the token which represents land title, it becomes like a bearer asset. And this is not a new idea. This is the original way that title used to be transferred for land, right? It was either
Hmm.
reputation or bearer assets.
Hmm.
Um, you have this bearer asset which allows you to transfer ownership. And then the only way that ownership gets transferred is through a blockchain transaction. And then what happens is that token, right, this non-fungible token, an interesting use case for NFTs, right?
Yep.
Not a
Yep.
right, can interact permissionlessly with a lending platform. In other words, it can
Yep.
permissionlessly become a collateral for a loan. And this is suddenly now you have the ability for people around the world to provide mortgages to people anywhere else in the world, for the entire
Yes.
system to be automated, for it to not require a court of law in order to manage dispute resolution. And then, if you reduce or eliminate the need for a court of law, you can now manage it with smart contracts, and the purpose, the sort of like the obvious reason that we needed a government in the first place, sort of dissipates.
Yeah. Do you think that so do you think that do you like the term Bitcoin circular economy, and do you foresee like Bitcoin like moving in this universe like for goods and services? And then is that if do you like that, or do you foresee stablecoins like playing that role? And yeah, I'll get your answer to that, because then the question is Bitcoin circular economy moving as currency direct, like is that compatible with a DeFi world where anyone can produce credit and extend it to other people?
Right. So I think circular economy is a bit of a redundancy. An economy, by definition, is circular. In other words, the
Mhm.
economy is that which allows for production of goods and services.
Mhm.
So if you're not producing goods and services, you don't have an economy. You maybe have a market, but it's not the same, right? I don't
Mhm.
think Bitcoin right now has much of an economy. It doesn't have no economy, but it's got a relatively minor economy. And I do think that the bridge there is Bitcoin-backed stablecoins.
Mhm.
And I believe this on the basis of historical precedent. Money throughout all of history, with the exception of, let's call it, from 1971, so the last 50 years, has
Mhm.
been stable coins, right,
Mhm.
backed by and redeemable for some kind of commodity money. That commodity money has been gold or silver,
Yeah.
typically.
Yep.
We now have Bitcoin. And so local currencies redeemable for Bitcoin
Yep.
is the future.
Uh, So, and I prefer like, is it fair to call a stablecoin like credit? Like it's credit. Like
Yeah.
you've received credit. Someone has extended you credit on some basis. Like in yeah. So I like as I think about the future and think about the intersection between dissent, like to put super harsh like legacy analogies on it, it's like Sovryn like is a like bank, like, and you can withdraw, like, you can receive credit from like financial service providers are not bad. Like the financial service providers are not bad in and of themselves. The broken currency and corruption is bad in and of itself. And so having their like the future, in the way that I'm seeing it, there will be financial service providers, and we'll be able to compare one's on Lightning, one's on Rootstock, one's on Liquid, one's on Stacks with Bitcoin as the base money. And you can go to each of these places and receive credit or receive financial institutions or just financial services. And then businesses here in this universe, instead of having a sticker in my window that says, I accept credit from Visa and credit from MasterCard and credit from Discover, I'm going to say, I am willing to like produce things for Bitcoin, which is money, or credit from Rootstock, credit from Lightning, credit from Liquid. Like, and so
So
yeah, what
I
do you think
agree
about
with
that?
you. Agree with you with one exception. In
Mm-hmm.
a world that isn't fiat, you don't need to say I will accept credit from JP Morgan or Visa or Mastercard. Instead, you say I am willing to accept Bitcoin. And that's
Mm-hmm.
what it means to be a settlement layer. When
Mm-hmm.
you think about gold as it was a settlement layer, what did it mean? So
Mm-hmm.
there have been free banking eras in the world. The most important, because it was the only true free banking era, like pure, was the Scottish free banking era. But the US one and others worked
Mm-hmm.
on a similar basis. Every single bank created, and sometimes just companies created, their own
Yep.
money.
Yep.
And what allowed you to allowed these different institutions to accept the credit of the other was not that they trusted. It was a trustless system, right? They didn't trust the other system. They just knew it was redeemable for gold, and they trusted gold. And so you weren't accepting credit, you were accepting gold. And what kept them disciplined was that every single day they would settle between each other, right? So that,
Right.
Bank A would come to Bank B and say, listen, I've got this many gold credits. and if any of them defaulted, right, they could maybe default in one day of transaction, but they couldn't bring down the whole system. We can settle on an ongoing basis continuously. We don't even need to wait for the end of the day. We don't have end of day
Yeah.
settlement. We
Yeah.
have instantaneous. We have every 10 minutes settlement.
Mhm.
And so you don't need to trust really much credit at all. And so that's the difference between
Yep.
a fiat system and a credit-based system. A fiat system is a corruption or a perversion of the credit system. And so what Sovryn is doing is introducing Bitcoin-backed stablecoins, right? Bitcoin-backed dollars,
Yeah.
uh, which are redeemable for dollars on
Mhm.
a momentary basis. And so, this is bringing back the greenback, except now we have the orange back.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Talk to us about, I want to talk about the SOV token, and then there's three final questions. I want to talk about the SOV token, and then I want to talk about, you have a really great, we ask every guest to explain a tweet, and we've pulled a really good one for you about there's a lot of covert communism in Bitcoin maximalism. So teasing the audience for that, stick around for that. We're going to get the description of that. And then we wrap up by asking you, what's a Bitcoin product or service that doesn't exist yet that you would love to see exist? So those are the three that we're going to wrap with. Talk to us about the SOV token. We talked about the Bitcoin DeFi. We described Sovryn. We described its connection to the universe and its connection in online. And talk to us about how do the incentives work for people to build Sovryn, to put the code in place to build Sovryn, and is that tied to the SOV token?
Yes, so SOV token, and this is a crucial point to understand, is constructed not to be an altcoin and not to be a
Mhm.
coin at all. The coin of the realm in Sovryn is Bitcoin.
Mhm.
And how do we get to hyper Bitcoinization? It's by building an economy, as we mentioned earlier, the
Mhm.
creation of goods and services around Bitcoin. So
Mhm.
uh, SOV is the coordination token, the governance token, and the revenue token for the Sovereign platform. And it, as a platform and as a community, builds goods and services which generate revenue. And that revenue gets distributed to the SOV stakers on the basis of how long they're staking for.
Yep.
So you don't need SOV to use Sovereign. That would be absurd. We don't want to gate our users, right?
Mhm.
But in order to participate in the governance, in order to have a stake in Sovereign's future revenue stream, you do need SOV. And so if you think about Sovereign as sort of thinking about what a nation would look like without borders, you can think of SOV as thinking about what equity and stakehood might look like without courts of law.
Yep. So, and I love that phrase revenue token, and I loved how you talked about proof of commitment earlier. I thought that was great language for this, again, 2022, and trying to move new language into this discussion that's kind of been put into a rut. Do you think so? The revenue of Sovryn, is the revenue of Sovryn denominated in RBTC, or is it denominated in SOV, or both? And how do you think about, because I've had this podcast, I'm trying to also elevate the language around Sats flow, because owning assets that protect purchasing power is positive, super positive. Saving is positive. Lowering your consumption is positive. Also, owning things in the economy, like we beautifully covered, like the real economy, and just producing things for each other and having a community, having an economy. I want to see both those things mapped together. How do you measure the revenue and think about future revenue while you're valuing SOV token?
Yeah, so I mean, the answer to all of that is super simple.
Mhm.
There are fees for using the protocol. Like if you lend, borrow, there's an origination fee. You are lending on the system, and part of the interest that you would be earning is actually earned by the protocol, right? So you earn 90% of the interest, and the protocol earns 10% of the interest. And trading fees and things like that are earned by the protocol. They're earned in Bitcoin, or if they're earned in other tokens, they are converted to Bitcoin, and then they are paid out to the SOV stakers. So very, very simple. How much Bitcoin did you earn? How many sats did you earn? And why would you stake SOV? Because you want to earn sats. This is
Perfect.
a totally different idea from staking, where I'm going to put in a token and I'm going to get more of the token. That is fiat thinking, right? We're just going to keep inflating the number of tokens.
I,
Yeah.
No, beautiful. Like, and that is breaking new ground. To me, like I'm stretching my brain to separate, like, this is very complicated. Like, DeFi is complicated. And like there's people that are purposefully working on making it confusing. Like, also with that's like happening. And so thinking about owning SOV that's paying RBTC income, like, is like, that is new. Like, that is new and different. And you can analyze whether the sovereign code is secure and whether the people that are building it are being honest, and whether, you can analyze whether it is living up to what it's saying that it's doing. Totally, like, completely. But that is, yes, I just want to recognize that like that is different than like other systems, and so it feels fresh and different. So perfect. And I think to me it semi blends into this tweet, and so I'm excited to hear you talk about it. Like, so we'll throw it up on the screen for the users. It says it was a retweet of Alex Gladstein, and it was a different post about the Bitcoin community is not pro capitalism, and I believe it was written by someone in the Ethereum community. And Yago's retweet says there is a lot of covert communism in Bitcoin maximalism. Another example is the idea that BTC has value because it is stored energy. That's a crypto version of the Marx labor theory of value. Do you need any more context, or just help
No,
us
no,
unpack this?
I know what you're
Perfect.
talking about.
Hit it. Hit it.
So I think that Bitcoiners, without noticing, right, and this is what I mean by covert, right?
Mm-hmm.
They have adopted communist ideas um, in myriad ways, and we need to shake that shit off. So here's a few examples. Example number one: anyone who's launching a project with tokens, we need to reject, because they have a profit motive that we cannot trust. Excuse me? The profit motive is the basis of Bitcoin. Without the profit motive, Bitcoin has no security. This idea that everything needs to be a public good, which is to say everything should be free. I mean, think about the way Bitcoiners think. Like, I will support Lightning Network, but I won't support let's call it Sovryn, right? I won't support Sovryn, or I won't support Stacks, or I won't support whatever, right? Because there is the token and there's insiders who might profit, right? By the way, these insiders are the people who have been in the project since earlier, like, OG Bitcoiners. That suspicion, that is backdoor communism, right? Everything should be a public good is a misunderstanding of the importance of the profit motive for the correct application of incentives. Another example, the one that I gave in that tweet, right? So actually, that tweet is talking about another example. We need to kill, destroy, and more importantly, reject anything which is an altcoin. It is competing with Bitcoin as number go up technology, and therefore is a threat. Fine. But the way we get rid of those things is not by denying them, or even necessarily by calling them scams. It is by outcompeting them, right? We have to have the confidence of a predator, not of a prey animal. We're Bitcoiners. We eat meat, right? Another example is the block size wars that we mentioned, right? There it was. I think no person in the history of Bitcoin has caused as much damage to Bitcoin as Thamos, the moderator of Bitcoin Talk, and more importantly, of the Reddit Bitcoin subreddit. They decided to disallow, which is to say censor, the not approved think, the bad think of forking Bitcoin, right? In other words, we will not win in the realm of ideas. We will win in the realm of power. This is authoritarian and communist thinking again. The idea that Bitcoin is of value, whereas things that are proof of stake are not of value because Bitcoin holds um, electricity, right? It's a battery. It is, it's invaluable because it's expensive. This is absurd, right? Like you got a really bad hairdresser, and he takes 2 hours to cut your hair badly. How much value does that haircut have, right? I can tell you, as someone who gets bad haircuts, it has very little value, right? The fact that he put 2 hours in doesn't make it more valuable than the good guy who could do it in 15 minutes with a machine, right? The amount of effort that goes into creating something has no bearing on its value. The only thing that has any value, any bearing on its value, is demand. That's it, and that's Marx completely got that wrong. The labor theory of value that Marx has was that that value came from the man hours that went into a thing. Clearly not. I mean, this is self-evidently wrong in every everyday experience that we have. Only an intellectual could think that that's possibly true, or a Bitcoiner. And the list of ways in which we've become sort of like these covert communists goes on and on and on. And I would encourage Bitcoin returning to free market philosophy, read in tooth and claw. We will not go down quietly. We will not turn a blind eye. We will know more about these other systems. We will not be ignorant. We will be adversarial. We'll know more about Luna than the fucking lunatics. We will know more about Ethereum than the ETHs. We will know that proof of stake fails not because of some nonsense about how much electricity is required, but because proof of stake as an incentive system is fundamentally broken. We will be educated, we will be better, we will outcompete, and we will win. And that is my hope for Bitcoin.
Love that. I love that a lot. Love that a lot. So the final question we end on is just kind of a fun one, just to see where people see the future. Like your whole episode, basically what you're building is already towards this. What's a Bitcoin product or service that doesn't exist yet that you would use?
Yeah, so I want, and maybe we'll help try and build, or if someone wants to build this, I would be happy to help. A bank, a neobank. I would call it, if I was doing it, I would call it the Sovryn bank because it's a bank for sovereigns. But a bank, coming back to our idea of not having to trust anyone. Imagine you had a middleware layer, right? So you had like this neobank, like a mobile application, and you had an ACH number or an IBAN number. You had the ability to get your friends to send money there. You could use it with Cash App. You could get your salary paid there. But once the funds hit, right, they don't stay there. They immediately get converted into a Bitcoin-backed stablecoin. And now they are only in your custody. You no longer have the bank as your master. You have the bank as the minimal middleman that is required just to interact. And I don't see that again. I don't see it as an end game in any way. I see it as a middle game.
Yep.
And I think we are solidly starting to get into the middle game now.
Yep. Super well said. The way that I phrase that too is people talk about like cross blockchain like compatibility or like multi-chain compatibility. The two chains that I want to see work together the most are BTC and the ACH network. So totally agree. Totally agree. I think super good.
And debit cards, credit cards,
yeah,
right? I want to be able to spend the economic value of my Bitcoin without selling my Bitcoin, by borrowing against the Bitcoin, or by holding Bitcoin back stable coins. Use Lightning Network in the same, I want Lightning network and debit cards to be invisible to the user. They don't even know which one they're using. That's what I want. And for that, we need to pull the funds out of the banks, provide them in self-custody, but provide the same experience, the same seamless on-ramp, off-ramp as if I had my money in a bank.
Yeah, well said. Well said. What's the call to action for the users? Like if the listeners today haven't participated in like Bitcoin DeFi before, what's their call to action and where can they find you online?
All right. Well, right now I think is a super exciting time. Sovryn has just introduced, I think 2 days ago, as of our current talking, the whitelist for becoming a beta tester of Sovryn Zero. What is Sovryn Zero? It's a protocol that lets you borrow against your Bitcoin at 0% interest forever and pay it back whenever or never by letting your Bitcoin pay off the appreciation in your Bitcoin value actually pay off the loan for you. And the way this is done is by the issuance of Bitcoin-backed stablecoins. So now we are the ones who go burr, right? So if you want to try something out, I would go register for that whitelist, because I think that's the most exciting thing that you can do with your Bitcoin is hodl, but also gain access to the dollar value embedded in what you've DCA'd into and had the guts to hold. And then if you want to follow me, on Twitter, I'm at Edan Yago, EDANYAGO.
Perfect. And the URL for Sovryn is sovryn.app, right?
sovryn.app. That's correct. And so if you go to sovryn.app/zero, ZERO, you can get onto that waiting list.
Perfect. Yago, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you. This has been super fun.
Hey all, this is Brian. You can reach me on Twitter at Brain Harrington. Shoot me a DM with any feedback from today's episode. This has been a Choice App production. Bitcoin is becoming centric to personal finance, and we want to help you learn how to better engage with Bitcoin financial services. None of this is financial advice and is for education and entertainment only.